All right, good afternoon and welcome. I'm told since we have a live audience we're streaming for, we need to start right on time for this session. Welcome everyone, I'm Erin Sikorsky. I direct the Center for Climate and Security, which is a research institute based in Washington, DC. And the panel you are here for today in this room is called Feeding Resilience, Managing the Nexus of Climate Change, Food Systems, and Security. And this will really build on the previous session that we just had with the ambassador talking about this nexus, but we're gonna look at it from a little bit broader perspective than just the UN Security Council. So global hunger, as we discussed, is worsening humanitarian emergencies. We see food prices driving instability, climate change threatening the global food system, and both extremists and geopolitical challengers to the United States and other countries are capitalizing on these challenges. As was discussed in the previous panel, this is a vicious cycle, right? You've got upheaval resulting from food price shocks. You've got the targeting and weaponization of scarce food during conflicts. You've got global hunger, the demand for global hunger funding is sapping foreign assistance, and decimated farming livelihoods are driving instability and displacement. So it's a lot of challenges that require coordination among the food, climate change, and peace and security communities. And what we're gonna talk about today is different parts of those communities and how they can better work together to pursue no regrets interventions with co-benefits across this nexus. And I'm really pleased to have three excellent panelists joining me for this discussion. One you've already met in the previous section, Her Excellency, Ambassador Carolyn Rodrigues Birkett, who's the ambassador and permanent representative of the Permanent Mission of Guyana to the United Nations. We're also joined by Sarah Aliwa, who is a gender and climate specialist and a researcher at La Sapienza University, and Dr. Daniel Abrahams, who's a senior climate security advisor with the US Agency for International Development. And I'm gonna turn to them in a moment to share some of their perspectives on these topics, but I did wanna start very briefly by just providing you a bit of an update on a new report that we at the Center for Climate and Security released earlier in September, entitled Feeding Resilience, which was meant in a US context in particular to get at this triple nexus and propose policy responses to better address these threats. This report was framed under the twin premises that international stability is foundational to US national security and that food security is foundational to stability. We conducted about 18 months of research, engaged with hundreds of US and foreign experts, and produced a report that's been endorsed by dozens of national security leaders across the defense, diplomacy, development, intelligence, and research communities, including former heads of regional combatant commands in the United States, the former heads of US Pacific, Central, and Africa commands, former US ambassadors from 10 countries, as well as former senior intelligence, DoD, State Department, and USAID leaders. And I bring that up because I think it's important to show the range of leaders from across many different sectors that see these three issues, climate, food, and security, as critical to addressing going forward. And the report focused on three different challenges: this nexus of food insecurity and conflict, the geopolitics of food, and then the challenges and opportunities in achieving a more resilient food system. So looking at, as we transition, right, our agricultural systems going forward, how do we manage security risks in those ways? And I encourage you all to take a look at the report, which you can find on our website. And then there's a whole series of recommendations that are very focused on a US context, but I think have applicability in other countries and other regions as well. So with that, as a background and a backdrop for why we wanted to bring these people together, the first question that I've asked all of them to tackle in turn is to describe how, from where they sit, right, whether it's as a researcher, a US government official, an ambassador, how does the intersection of climate change, food systems, and security, how do you view it, right? and ask them to identify one risk at this nexus that they think is underappreciated, and how do they see gaps in programming, right? Whether it's in the climate space, the food space, or the security space, that need to be addressed to manage that risk. So both a problem and a risk, but then also a solution that you might propose. So I'm going to start with Sarah to my left.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you for inviting me for this critical discussion. And there are a lot of questions in one.
I know.
But yeah, I will start by having like agri-food system point of view. So starting from them, we can actually see how it's really the system that connects, it's the connection between people and the planet. So we know that it's vital for food, nutrition, health, economic stability, and so on, and human security in general. However, we are also witnessing that these systems are breaking down, and as they are struggling to meet the nutritional needs of our growing population. These structural weaknesses of these systems is actually compounded by more frequent external shocks. And within that, we also, if we add the lens of climate and the lens of conflict over natural resources, we also see all these problems getting even more complex and complicated. From the other end, we also see agri-food system being one of the major contributors to climate change, but at the same time also being one of the main victim of climate change. I think from my point of view, one of the risks that is underappreciated now, it's how we have a lack of like prevention and climate risk information, especially when it should be localized and it should be at the disposal of the most vulnerable groups. So talking about youth, women, especially rural women, indigenous people, and in general minorities. So in all this big picture, we also have then conflicts that it's already exacerbating by climate change, and that it's interesting to see how like the most fragile regions, like 70% we have of the fragile region are the one who are already, in the meantime, they are both affected by climate change, but they're also like having weak governance. So it's something that is overlapping. So it's also for us an indication of how these two topics are actually intertwined. So by looking at the key risk that we have in while we look at this critical nexus, for sure we have the first, in my opinion, it's the competition over natural resources. Then again, when it's combined with a weak governance, can also trigger conflict over natural resources, and something that's already happening in many parts of the world. We also have the deteriorating of livelihoods. So, like as I said before, there are many people, many actors that are playing a role part in the agri-food system. However, they are like also when climate shocks happen, they also have no other source of income. So usually, what happens often is that like this desperation can also lead to joining armed groups or like engage in illegal activities such as cattle riding. We also have the topic of climate-induced food spikes. So when climate events happen, we have also to look at the food supply chain. So this also lead at food prices that are rising, and we saw that also with the war in Ukraine, even though it was not climate-induced conflict, but there was a crazy increasing of the food prices of over 20%, not only in Europe. And another important point, it's regarding on the mobility and displacement topic, which is can be related to climate. And this usually occurs especially within political marginalized communities. So when this is happening is actually they have to move from their area of origins and they have to go to another country. Usually this is happening in already, the destination country is already strained with the natural resources. So that can lead also to other conflicts among vulnerable groups, vulnerable communities. So I can I can tell you, like, based on this main risk that I think are the main that are affecting agri-food system, it's not only part of the problem, it can also be part of the solution. And especially I want to point out the risk and crisis management. It's really important that we support countries and communities to be aware to implement a system that actually can monitor and prevent climate impacts on agriculture. This crisis risk information can also help us anticipate and take action, adapt before, like, we lost livelihoods and life. It's also really important from an agri-food system point of view to invest in climate resilience, climate smart agriculture practices that can also, in the meantime, also strengthen the short-term adaptation, but also the long-term resilience. And it can also be a way to reduce the marginalization of communities by building capacity among them, and then therefore also reduce the risk of conflict among these groups. Finally, I think also that it's one of the most important things that we need to look at is to really support those who are most affected by this topic, these issues, such as women, youth, and displaced people. We should, again, help them with the building skills to actually adapt to the climate shocks. But at the same time, it's like I have this question in mind that I can't find an answer. So what kind of offer, what kind of solution we can offer when we talk about internally displaced people? Because they're already living a dimension with compounded vulnerabilities, compounded uncertainty. Like they are not located like as a migrants people. They might have more like reference point. They might have more like rights, or at least just more safety networks. While we talk about internally displaced people, it's even I think the situation is even worse. And yeah.
No, thank you so much for that rich answer, and maybe our other panelists, or even in the discussion toward the end of the session, we can get at that question about IDPs. I mean, a couple things I would draw out of your answer that I heard. One was this idea that helping the most vulnerable adapt to these challenges can provide co-benefits across societies and countries, right, by reducing risks of conflict and instability that might stem. So I think that's an important thought. Two other things, just the role of governance that you mentioned, which I hope we can talk about more, and this need to downscale information and data to get it in the hands of people at the local level, which I know is something that USAID and others have been working on. But Daniel, let's turn it to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for hosting this, and for, really, it's an excellent report. And for those who haven't checked out Feeding Resilience, I encourage you to do so, because I think it highlights, certainly from a development perspective, a lot of the core issues that we're thinking about, right? From the perspective of development, food security is both a cause and a consequence of the issues that we're trying to address. And, of course, is an issue unto itself that is central to what we do. So, noting that I have my FuseNet colleagues in the room, their analysis, the best-in-class analysis on food security and famine early warning, they point to two really disturbing trends, or one disturbing trend, if you want to look at it this way. The two biggest drivers of food insecurity worldwide right now are climate change and conflict. Irrespective of their relationship to each other, they are both trending in the wrong direction, and they should be raising all of our alarms, because they are physically coming together, right? The impacts of climate change and the impacts of conflict are coming together in the same physical spaces in really powerful and destructive ways. So as mentioned in the report, Erin, of the dozen countries with more than 1 million people facing emergency level food insecurity, 10 are experiencing high or extreme levels of conflict. It is a deeply worrying, and to my colleague's point, it is a cyclical risk. So I'm going to express my comments primarily from an operational perspective. Like, what does that actually mean from a development perspective to have these two issues come together. And fundamentally, it's about integration. It's about trying to figure out how do you jerry-rig your climate programs onto your conflict programs onto your climate programs, and ultimately, how do you think about food security in that vein? So there is a lot that we are doing, and probably a lot more that we can be doing to do just that. So increasingly, the relationship between our humanitarian, our development, and our peace work is being thought about in the term the HDP nexus. How do we bring these together? A great example of that is the US government Global Food Security Strategy has a new intermediate result focused on conflict as a cross-cutting issue. So promising in the sense that we're figuring out ways to bring these issues together. In terms of what is underappreciated, and something that I appreciate about this report, is I do think that the importance of the weaponization of food as a critical geopolitical risk is something we all need to be thinking about. I think there's been a lot of really great work about thinking about water in particular in this issue, but what's interesting and again, deeply concerning about food is it's not confined to the geography of production, right? This is a global threat that can manifest or be leveraged in a lot of different ways. We've seen it in small communities in northern Burkina Faso, in subregions in and around northern Ethiopia, and of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the implications for global food prices. So in each of these, the weaponization of food has driven the risk of famine and driven conditions characterized by extreme lack of food, of high and rising levels of acute malnutrition, and increasing hunger-related death. Threats unto themselves and also decreasing adaptive capacity. So in terms of the gaps, again, I'm going to stay operational here. As somebody that sits in a conflict bureau, something I think about a lot is how can we understand conflict mitigation or peace-building programs as a means of disaster resilience and a driver of food security? Right? What is the role of addressing conflict or on markers of food security and nutrition? And I think from a development perspective, that is a very difficult thing to capture because it is inherently a counterfactual. But it is incredibly important, and it's important for a lot of reasons, some of which have come out of the room today or throughout this conference, of, for example, the importance of stories in getting political buy-in for peace-building efforts. And also for ensuring that partners to USAID, or partners to other development donors are getting the appropriate due for the type of work they're doing. So I would say thinking about those issues collectively and remembering that these are issues that are going to overlap spatially are really important ways forward, and I think that the guidance in the report really accurately captures that point.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. And I promise I didn't pay him to say those kind words about the report. No, but I appreciate that it was read and absorbed. Two things that you brought up I'll highlight. I mean, I'm glad you focused operationally because I think a lot of this work that we're talking about is not sexy declarations at conferences or COPs, but it's the inner, machinery of institutions, right, and government, and getting them to work together more effectively. And that takes time and effort and commitment, but is critically important. And the other piece that you mentioned toward the end there about the storytelling and how do you prove a negative, but how important it is, I think, not only to build the political will, but also to convince funders, right, and donor governments and Congress in the US case that putting money behind peace-building initiatives can have lots of different benefits across many issues. And so the more we can tell those stories, I think the better off we'll be. Ambassador, can I turn to you now, please?
Thank you, Erin. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing you're having me a second time.
Oh, definitely a good thing. We had too little before.
You've asked 3 questions. How we view this intersection. And as I mentioned before, the the intersection between climate change and food systems, because we're talking about food systems here, and peace and security is very clear for us. What we worry about is that this is not new. In fact, if we look back to when the Sustainable Development Goals were approved in 2015, it was the same year we saw food insecurity or food security, the progress we've made in the decades before that, rolling back. And from then to now, that has not changed. And so this is an urgent matter, but somehow we are not acting on it with the urgency it deserves. And since then, we know that conflict and climate change are the leading drivers of food insecurity. So the way we view it is that this is not seen as an urgent matter, and we are going to be seeing more conflicts because of this and more food insecurity. And we focus, because it's a security conference, we focus on the conflict areas. But let's not forget that the report last year on the state of food security and nutrition in the world, more than 2 billion people were moderate or severely, moderate to severely food insecure. So where we might be seeing relative peace right now, that peace might not be sustainable because a hungry man is an angry man. And when you juxtapose climate change into that, land degradation, desertification, droughts, and floods, then it is going to be an even greater problem as we're seeing in some areas. In terms of the gap, or before I say that, and Daniel, I think, mentioned the global report on food crisis, or no, you were speaking about the other report. But imagine this year, 2024, it's the year when we have seen, from last year to now, acute food insecurity doubled last year to now. And of course, we can factor in where those wars are and so on. But I think that this is the worst report we've ever had. And so not to sound doomsday, but I think we need to act. In terms of the gaps, I would say that the financing gap is a real one. We're not short of the science. We're not short of the reports. We know what we have to do. In many of the developing world, the issue of finance is a real one. In some of our countries, the rates we have to borrow at is far higher than a developed country, and the needs are more. And this is why we call for concessional financing, taking into account the vulnerabilities of various countries. So one of the financing gap remains real. And every year we go to COP, we make the annual pilgrimage to COP, and we hear commitments repeated, but those commitments are not fulfilled. And so I think when we talk about these things, we have to recognize that. My other point on the gap, I would say, and this is from where I sit and coming from Guyana, I think we are not making enough use of our youth. We have to get our youth involved more in agriculture. People like to say, make agriculture sexy. So for example, we even change terminologies back home. We just don't say farming. We say agricultural entrepreneurs, doing shade houses, doing all these different things. And we have seen an uptick in the number of young people being engaged in this. We are seeing right now in certain parts of this world, I would not name countries, where young people going from childhood to adulthood through war, they are basically ripe for recruitment into groups where we don't want them to be. And so I think we need to look at that. And your final question, I think, is about what we need to do to manage these risks. I think apart from continuing the discussions, those discussions got to be focused on what are the real actions, as Daniel and Sarah said, that we need to do on the ground. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And it's fascinating to hear about just how changing how we talk about these things for different audiences, like young people, can really make a difference in the uptick there. And your comment, a hungry man is an angry man, reminds me of one of my favorite lines in the U.S. National Security Strategy that the Biden administration put out a few years ago, which says, if a parent can't feed their children, then nothing else matters. And they put that up front in the security strategy as a way to foreground these issues as being critical in how they approach national security. And I think you've seen that in how they've pushed forward a lot of food security programming. But you're right, the financing gap is huge and will grow without efforts to both address it and fulfill commitments, but also, as you mentioned, get ahead of places that are currently stable, right, but that risk spilling over into instability and conflict when we look to the future and where they're going with food security, which I think is so important and frankly, a place where the argument that a few dollars today saves you many dollars in the future is one we need to be making more. Well, a lot of richness here. I do have follow-up questions for each of you, and then we're going to open it to the room for discussion. But Sarah, I'm going to come back to you now so we can dig a little deeper on this intersection with gender issues, because I know that's your specialty, and talk about how you think about adding a gender lens to this conversation. And also, are there lessons that we can draw from past experiences trying to mainstream gender into security, right, as we look at this triple nexus? Because I think we risk sometimes this approach of everything, everywhere, all at once, it's all connected and systemic, makes it hard, I think, to focus, as the ambassador was saying. So how do we bring in these different lenses but not become overwhelmed?
Thank you, Irene. So I'll start from something that I was already mentioning before without even really saying what we call it usually, the threat multiplier, no? That's how we refer usually when we talk about climate change. We know that it's exacerbating conflict, human security, resource scarcity, but at the same time, we also need to acknowledge that this threat is not affecting everyone in the same way. Although everyone is affected, it's not really affecting everyone in the same way. And I think that while adopting a gender lens, it can help us to better understand when we talk about conflict, security, resource scarcity, and migration. So we know that climate-induced shortage can deepen inequalities. For instance, we know also that 70% of the household usually rely on women for water collection. And when climate stresses and extreme events happening, such as droughts and floods, the situation of women, the daily routine of women that are usually in charge of collecting water, it just changed suddenly. So they actually have to go further. They have to walk further to collect these basic resources. And at the same time, they increase the workload of them. But at the same time, they also expose them on more gender-based violence, on the exposure of gender-based violence. We also see this when climate events happening and there is a disruption of livelihoods, especially when we're talking about farming and fishing. There are many research that actually shows that this disruption can lead also to an increasement of domestic violence, especially because it's tied to social norms and gender roles. So the men, they are not they don't see themselves as a providers, and that can also lead to this kind of intra-household dynamics. And this is all driven by conflict and climate-related conflict. For instance, another case that we see, it's in East Africa, where the droughts have escalated tensions between pastoralists and farmers. So another practice, which is the cattle riding, it's also really related to this perspective of the masculinity. So what is the ideally provision of idea of men as a provider. So, and in order to achieve that, to to respect that role, they also might engage in this cattle riding, which can also exacerbate conflict among communities. Another point, it's again, climate-induced migration, that it's both can be both forced and voluntary, and it also adds another layer to the climate situation. However, we increasingly is acknowledging migration as a strategic adaptation strategy, we say, to climate change, especially when it's conducted under safe and voluntary conditions. However, the decision-making behind the migration is really complex, and it's not really directly related only to climate factors. There are other factors such as gender, financial status, disability that actually can impact the decision whether to migrate or not. So what happened, it's in some region, especially for instance, there is this interesting study in Eastern Chad that shows that how men, they usually migrate more often rather than the women, and the women that they are left behind, they're actually left behind in a resource-strained environment. And also due to social norms most of the time, or they don't really have the means for moving. So it's also helping us to see migration also as a privilege, which is not something that everyone can do. So I think we should also focus on those who are left behind. Sometimes we tend to see the women as passive victims. We call it the Penelope archetype. So they're waiting for the men to send their remittances, or they're waiting for the men, to go back to their country. However, there is also an opportunity for projects and progress to actually have some intervention that help the women that are left behind, and really empower them and supporting them as agents of change. This can be made especially through localized intervention when we talk about, again, climate smart agriculture, when we try to apply, for instance, crop rotation or irrigation method. These practices can actually reducing the immigration pressure, while also helping the people that doesn't have the mean, or maybe just they don't want to leave their country, to really become more resilient. And it's also been shown in Ghana, for instance, that these practices were implemented and there was a decreasing in migration patterns. So it's something that in my work, of course, always to be based on the local context. And when talking about, and that's the last point I want to make on the climate smart practices, I don't want to give for granted that everyone can access to these practices, and it's also important to acknowledge that there are several gender barriers that should be addressed before getting to these practices, such as the lack of lands right for women, or access to education or climate information. So to really to really improve the resilience of the women in general who are left behind or doesn't want to migrate, we really need to first look at the gender gap in agriculture and increase their access to resources, education, climate information. And I think that we can't really have a big picture without a gender lens. We miss half of the picture, and I think it's our duty also to have a gender perspective when we talk about those topics. Lesson learned. So from lesson learned from during my research and also my experience in the field, I see that there are some lessons learned that we could put in practice, and I will be a bit starting from this gender mainstreaming things that we have. I think that we really focused a lot, and it's great that we really raised the awareness on gender mainstreaming, but at the same time we maybe put too much focus on the internal procedures, so such as training session within the organization, checklist, and policy documents, which is really important, but we also have to focus on tangible improvements in the ground for women, girls, boys. And to do that, we really have to integrate gender into the design, planning, and monitoring of the intervention with the related sex disaggregated indicators. So to be more focused on the real impact and real outcomes on this programming. Another key lesson is the importance of including the local communities, particularly rural women, in the decision-making process. We often see this top-down, experts-driven intervention that usually they don't really put at the center the affected population, and in most of the cases are rural women. And as I said before, are also the ones who are managing the natural resources. So it's actually a missed opportunity if we don't manage to really hear their voice and what they really think that's their priority, and what they're like the route they prefer to do to get the water. So there are all small things that we actually can incorporate, and we need to put ourselves more in to listen the most affected person. And I also think that we should challenge within the gender programming, which is challenge the traditional gender norms. So sometimes we have this project where we empower women by creating job opportunity in doing soap with, I don't know, argan oil, so they can sell the soap. And then, but it's a way also of reinforcing the stereotypes that we already have, unfortunately. So it can be like interesting if we can expand also the economic opportunities for women by giving training also on non-traditional sectors such as energy, agriculture, technology, and at the same time also promoting the men in, I don't know, like caregiving or household roles, no? So we should be the first one who challenge these traditional norms instead of adapting also the programming, because of course they're cultural sensitive of the local context, but that doesn't means that we have to accept it without trying to move it a little bit, shake it a little bit, while respecting the cultural norms. It's also really important to support women's group. Like, for instance, I also work with FAO, and there is this project. It's one of the best projects. It's happening in Yemen, where Water Users Association, with a quota of women, they actually managed to resolve a 15 years conflict within the district of Yemen. So all of this was possible because, again, the women were involved in the consultation. The women were the one that were prioritizing what was really needed for them, since they are the first agent of going and getting the water. So in general, to support the collective agency of this group of women, that can be pool savings, it can be shared labor, and so many other experiences. And finally, we already have many policy framework global initiatives that we can leverage on, such as national determined contribution, RED Plus implementation, and national adaptation plan. So here it can be a good entry point also now to bridge the gender gap between agriculture and climate action. Yeah, I think there was also another question on the everyone, everywhere.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you'd like to keep going, or you really covered the waterfront there in your responses, so we can come back to you on that if you want. Thanks. Yeah, no, and I mean, I love all those lessons learned, and I think I would love to read a paper by you on that, frankly, because I think there's so much there, and I'm really glad you brought up the migration piece as well and the complexities there, but also the opportunities. I know USAID has done some work looking at its Feed the Future program in Central America and found that recipients of Feed the Future investments have a much less interest in migrating than other folks within the same country, because they've had that help in managing their agricultural livelihoods. And you gave some examples too that I wasn't aware of from Ghana and elsewhere, so I think that's really important. to bring to the conversation. So thank you. Daniel, I'm going to ask you about the new framework for climate security, which Assistant Secretary Witowski mentioned on her panel. How do you see this conversation about climate and food fitting into that framework, and how is the U.S. and particularly USAID thinking about its relationship with partner countries like Guyana and other organizations in tackling this nexus? And I realize as I read these questions that I ask you guys many questions to answer, but I know you're up to it.
No, there's a lot to answer. And actually, you know what? Let me ask you a question. Can you repeat what you said earlier? Which I love that you have a favorite line in the national security strategy. But would you mind repeating that? Because that's going to really relate to what I was saying.
Sure. That if a parent cannot feed their child, nothing else matters.
Right. I mean, I think that underscores my very biased opinion that USAID has a central role to play in the U.S. national security infrastructure. So in terms of how we're approaching the framework, so I keep giving you all reading, but I would suggest checking it out because it offers quite a bit of latitude to the departments and agencies to really run with this question of what does climate change and security mean for each department and agency. And for USAID, this is really an operational question. So as Secretary Witowski mentioned, it follows a assess, partner, invest framework. And we can think about that in a lot of different ways, but when you consider the work that we're doing, and if we come back to this point, that a vast majority, roughly 75% of USAID's work exists in the backdrop of conflict. 100% of that work is also dealing with the effects of climate change. So this gives us a chance to really, find the space between existing work, how, for example, the Global Fragility Act, how do we better integrate climate change into that? How do we consider the conflict elements and the conflict mitigation of the president's flagship resilience policy, prepare? And again, this comes down to how we program, and therefore it comes down to how we partner with implementing agencies, how we partner with governments to actually get this work on the ground. And I really appreciate Sarah's concrete examples, because that's reflective of what climate security often looks like in programming. It manifests in terms of governance, it manifests in terms of land rights, it manifests in terms of water access. So this gives us a chance to codify, if you will, what it means to address climate security with development. But I think, Aaron, your question is the spirit of your question feels to me programmatic and operational. And I think that is how we are thinking about this issue, right? Everything was granular is how do we appropriately develop the MEL frameworks that capture the food security implications of conflict, or capture the conflict mitigation elements of our food security programs to do this work? How do we account for the risks that for those of us that have operated in conflict-affected areas, that doing climate change work is just harder? It's more expensive. How do we support our partners? How do we provide the tools they need in order to be able to do that work? And I think that coming back to the framework, the way it is laid out, it is up to each department and agency to say how you will address the challenges of climate change and security. So how we will do that, based on the very nature of the issues that we're dealing with, will require, one, a very strong consideration of food security. Two, a very strong consideration of how our increasing demand on our strain on our humanitarian infrastructure can be answered with our conflict and development infrastructure. And ultimately, what we can do for our partners, again, government and implementing partners, in order to make sure they are able to carry out what is described in the framework.
Thanks. And again, I'm liking the connections here between the different panelists. You talked a lot about evaluation, right? How can you make sure these programs are addressing these issues? And Sarah, you brought up this lesson learned from I think the women, peace, and security context is it's not just enough to say "and women" or "and climate" in documents, right? That's easy, but it doesn't actually get you there, and it's much harder, but much more important to evaluate the actual impact, right? Not just how many times the word is mentioned in a document, which is a starting point, but can't be the ending point, right? All right, Ambassador, I'm going to come back to you now and talk a little bit more. You spoke about the role of the UN Security Council in addressing climate, food, and peace nexus, and I love that you ended your remarks by saying, "I've made my case," right? And it's a strong case. But as you work to push that forward, how are you thinking about connecting that work in that institution with other lines of effort on the topic? How do you bring them together? And particularly, how do you think about breaking down silos among different sectors and groupings to link and layer the work to address these risks? And I ask this because, you mentioned the financing gap, and I'm afraid when I look at the numbers in the US now, with $100 billion is what they're saying the recovery from Helene is going to cost, right? We're going to be scraping to get every dollar we can on the international stage for these issues. And so how do we maximize the programming that exists so we're not just waiting for more money to come in?
Thank you, Erin. And perhaps I can roll back a bit more in terms of how we connected from country to the Security Council first. Our advocacy on climate and food security started a long time ago because of our circumstances, because of the region in which we live. For example, in the Caribbean, you have countries that import as much as 90% of their food. So when there's a price hike, when there's an oil price hike, they're heavily affected. We're all very affected. But we didn't only highlight the challenges, we also highlighted the solutions, and we also spoke about what we are doing. And so, for example, several years ago in COP, you would not have heard about forests. And the same way there is a bit of a pushback on discussing peace and climate, you had an issue with discussing forests as a part of the climate solution. But you never give up. And one of the reasons is because in my country, we're the second in the world for the most forest-covered country. And over 80% of the country is covered with forests. And we have been preserving this forest very deliberately. But we go to COP and we say, look, we also want development, or people want development. And they're saying, well, should we keep the forest standing? How are they paying people to replant forests, those who have, deforested? And we who have our standing forests, we're not compensated for that. And so we went about that for a very long time. Forest is now part of that, but we still have to go much further than that. But we have, just for example, in terms of our carbon credit scheme, we have been selling credits, and out of that, 15% goes directly to indigenous communities because of the role they play in protecting the environment. But also, they are the front lines of climate change as well. So these are some of the things that we have been doing. And our forests, just to perhaps give you an idea, it's the size of England and Scotland, and it stores 19.5 gigatons of carbon. So it's not, a small area. We also continue to advocate for a global tax on fossil fuels and for getting rid of subsidies, even though we're a newcomer into this market, into the oil and gas market as well. And like I mentioned before, we've been advocated for the climate finance commitments to be fulfilled. So we've been doing a lot of this. So, and in the Caribbean community, Guyana has the lead role for food security. So we've been doing work on that, trying to, by next year, reduce the food import bill by 25%. So the work on the council is a natural progression of what we've been doing nationally and regionally. But how do we connect these efforts now? I think we are looking to all these different spaces. And this is why we first started in the council. We're talking here today. We're going to be at COP, but also within the groups which we're in the Commonwealth, in AOSIS, and so on. And we're going to continue to advance partnerships with different countries as well. How do we break down the silos? And I say this, I know we have UN agencies in the room. I worked for a UN agency before doing this job as well. But I think sometimes when you have a couple of member states say, don't touch this issue, there's a pullback, by the agencies and so. So I think that we have to continue to break down those kinds of silos, be brave, do the work, continue to do the work, and so that we can have the UN agencies, other bodies, governments, the private sector as well, having a more structured kind of discussion on this nexus. And I also believe that the council, and I've given this description before, it's almost like everybody sees it as the trauma room of the world. You only come there when you're almost dying, when there's a conflict, and you either survive or you don't, right? But the council also has a prevention responsibility. And so I think we have to also look at that clearly, break down silos there so that we also focus on prevention. But I'm hopeful because given the global awareness and conversation surrounding this whole climate security, food insecurity nexus, there is stronger interest in the topic. Guyana and Switzerland, for example, are co-focal points on hunger in the Security Council. And we've managed to have the council discuss the food security situation in Sudan, in Gaza, after white notes were produced by UN agencies. So I think I am optimistic. We just had the Pact for the Future. I like the Pact for the Future, but I think when I look at it, I see a lot of things that we were talking about many years ago that today would have been that future. Something like phones, you add a little bit to it every year and say it's a new one, right? But I think it's what we've all subscribed to, and there's opportunity there. There's opportunity in the new agenda for peace as well. And so we have to continue that work. And let's continue to do more research and analysis as well. We should never stop doing that. I think this would, help and understanding each other. You may have a different view to me, but when we speak to each other, we might see it might be on another issue. I'll give you one example. There was the Summit for Small Island Developing States. Now, everybody knows that they are the front lines in terms of vulnerability to climate change. And in negotiating that document, and you speak about words sometimes in documents, but the UN, a lot of times, it's about words, right? And there was a pushback on mentioning security in terms of climate. But after a lot of work, the word is there. That's a little movement, but I think it's an important movement that we can build on. And so I think we need to consider all options. If now we cannot do all of this globally, let's do it regionally, and let's build on those blocks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that call to be innovative and creative in how we approach this, right? And not just be path dependent on one type of organization or agreement, and appreciate Guyana's leadership in the Security Council to continue pushing. Yes, it's worth a round of applause there. Excellent. Well, now it's time to hear from all of you in this room with questions or interventions. And I believe we'll have some microphones coming around. Yes? Okay. So let's start here with the gentleman in the blue and then the lady a little bit further back.
Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful session. I don't know if this is supposed to be a question or... Okay, I know there are professionals in the room, and I want to pose this very personal question. And I'm going to be stating a few facts, although I stand to be corrected, that... If 70% of the space we call our home, our habitat, which is the earth, is covered by water, and we have 30% left for about the 8 billion people, And out of that 30%, maybe we lose another 10% to hills, mountain ranges, and valleys. So the question is, how do we ensure food security in the face of geometrically rising population? Out of the 20% of the land availability, we are losing a huge chunk to banditry, terrorism, kidnapping, insurgency, militancy in the areas or regions that those are prevalent. In some other regions, we have climate challenges like droughts, floods, also eating into that 20 remaining percent. Minding that we are seeing a geometric rise in population globally. Researchers have shown that GMOs, are actually not a way to go because their input on human health has not been really ascertained. And we know that ensuring food security would need all the available fertile land we can have. With all these inputs eating into this available fertile land, what is the way out?
Thank you for that question. I think we'll take a couple questions together and then we'll let the panel respond.
Thank you for a really interesting panel. I run a large research project that studies people coming out of armed groups. And we interview thousands of people across 6 countries, and we follow them for a period of years. I'm sitting here with one of my research collaborators from Northeast Nigeria, where we ask people coming out of the Boko Haram factions if they would ever consider going back. And those that say yes always point to a dominant reason, which is food insecurity. They also mention, usually in the same sentence, that they haven't been eating regularly. Some have mentioned ingesting rocks just to have their stomach have something to do. I used to work in counterterrorism, so to me, it seems like a win-win to just feed the population to prevent people from flowing back into these groups. But it's not happening. And some of the reasons have been mentioned, maybe lack of funding, local politics, but one hasn't. On the CCVI map we saw earlier today, many of those hotspots have groups that are listed or sanctioned. We have donor conditionalities that expressly forbid working with populations even suspected to be associated with these groups, including for children under 5. Plumpy nut becomes problematic. How do we get around some of these challenges? And even when a group maybe has a carve-out, like in the Security Council for the Lake Chad Basin, but we still see people holding back, humanitarians holding back, because they're concerned of being on the wrong side of the law. So another challenge to the panel and a question of how we navigate this to make sure people are fed and address conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. Two very easy questions to answer in a brief moment here, but would anyone like to jump in on either one of those or both? Yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
I will quickly address the first question, which I think the gentleman who raised these points, which is land is scarce, populations are growing, land is degrading, and I would say one of the areas where at least USAID has had seen success in interventions in addressing climate change and security fundamentally are about land rights, use, and access. And I think that there is a quantity problem that you raise, but there's also sort of a governance and a rights issues. And I think we could probably add to your list, right? I think we could add what we see coming down the pipe of incredible demand for land for critical minerals as being a further stressor. But I think what we have seen in many very diverse contexts is supporting negotiations, supporting rights, supporting clear access are powerful conflict mitigation activities, but often we find that also has really important resilience outcomes as well. So I don't think it's a perfect solution, but I would say from a development perspective, really emphasizing land use rights and access, including customary land rights use and access, is a centrally important way to address some of the problems that you raised.
Go ahead, Ambassador.
Thank you for your question. And I'm an eternal optimist, even though hope can sometimes be resignation. But mankind has always innovated. And I think that we can solve the food security issue, even with the land degradation, desertification, and so on. We can. And one of the ways I think that we need to leapfrog is with technology transfer. We're a rice-producing country, for example, in Guyana. And I recall visiting places where the yield was like 3 times what we were producing, and the cost of production was much less, similar soil. And so I think we have to do a lot on technology transfer amongst our different countries. Sometimes even within large countries, you need to do that as well. I think now I was reading a study the other day where our population have more degrees than ever before. What are they studying? Food has to be one of that. But we also have to address the issue of food loss and waste. It's a big issue. It's 1/3 of all the food we produce is either lost or wasted. And this is an issue, I think, if we're putting more pressure on the environment to produce food and then we're wasting it, then that's a problem. But you spoke about the water. Protecting our oceans is also very important. The last I checked, we have actually gotten to the threshold of natural fishing. Hence, a lot of increase in aquaculture and so on. But how we manage our resources in the oceans, it's also very important. On the point made about the people answering yes, that they will go back because in these groups they can have food. This is why it's such a complex issue. And if we take Haiti, for example, right now, the latest report that we've seen is that children are joining gangs, right? Because food is a real issue and belonging is also an issue. And so we're saying that as we address the political issues, you have to address the humanitarian issues alongside the development issues. People must be able to see that this is better, but we have to invest in that. Comes back to the financing, because sometimes we put a lot of effort into how can we resolve this conflict, but we don't put the development aspect into resolving that. And as we all know, humanitarian assistance is an emergency assistance. The longer-term development is what we have to look at. So I agree completely with you that we have to do much, much more work to ensure that people don't slip back into conflict for a basic thing like food.
Sarah, briefly, and then hopefully we can fit in maybe 2 more questions after. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to add to what the ambassador just mentioned, trying to address your question. I also agree that like the bureaucracy and the procedures that we have in place, they are not really reflecting the reality and what we really need in the ground. So one main thing should be to be more flexible in this procedure. However, it takes really long time. So we need something that it's more concrete and immediate. And just yesterday I was in this workshop with one colleague from UN Women, and they were mentioning these new funding programs that were trying to avoid this kind of requirement, especially for new NGOs and associations. So what comes on my mind is like, okay, maybe for those people who are already in this conflict area, it might be something useful to like be within a local-led organization that can be part of the consortium. It's like a consortia where the lead organization, which is maybe one of the more recognized and maybe has an historical proof that they are like an agency that you can trust, an organization, small organization that you can trust, then can be the one who takes the funding from that development big agency, and then among them, like as other partners, also trying to address matters of food insecurity by delivering food in the immediate and the short-term period of time. But I think, yeah, we need really to rethink also about what are the best and the more efficient mechanism to really address this issue. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's take 2 more questions. Let's go here and then across.
So thank you very much for the discussion, first of all. My question is, how does, in your opinion, the energy transition intersect with the nexus between climate change and food security? And I'm asking this question because while on the mitigation relevance of renewables, we all agree, when it comes to adaptation, the debate is still open. So also, due to the fact that there are many maladaptation risks connected to the energy transition, of course. So I was curious to hear from you if, in your opinion, beyond their role in carbon mitigation, renewables can actually contribute to climate adaptation within the food systems. Thank you in advance.
We'll take both questions and then, yeah.
Thank you very much. For the ambassador, how do we balance the forests with food production, taking into consideration lately the EU deforestation law, which of course had to be deferred, the implementation had to be deferred. Many partners were quite uncomfortable with its implementation. You said it well earlier that we have all these standing forests because we are the ones that conserved them. The communities know how to do this, but now the communities are also the ones that want to eat. So how do we find that well balance between agriculture and afforestation? And then secondly, you spoke about participating in the carbon market space. I'm a proponent of carbon markets, but I'm also quite cautious about having communities subsidize brown industries as well, particularly in the voluntary carbon markets. So how do you ensure that even as you play in the voluntary carbon market space, you know, the pricing is right and you're not further subsidizing the brown industries and those that are buying Guyanese credits? And I mean, I have a couple more questions, but I will stop there.
Okay.
But this was a fantastic session. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. The first question on the energy transition, does anyone want to take that, or should we turn to you, Ambassador, since you were called out specifically?
Thank you. I think it was a really good question. We like to say that the energy transition must be a just one. And I would tell you why. We've been hearing in many spaces that we must stop fossil fuel exploration and production. This is the only way we are going to be able to reduce emissions in the way we would like it to be reduced. Now, the reason we say the energy transition should be just, if we take that and make it policy, then we would be creating a monopoly for those who already are in the fossil fuel business. And remember, a lot of the countries that are considered developed now were developed on the back of fossil fuels and on industrialization and so on. So here comes little Guyana now. 5 years ago, discovering oil. The question was, do you tell your population, let's leave it there? We're going to wait on this climate finance and we're going to get some solar power here and there and so on. But it's the moral thing to do. It's the right thing to do. No, we can't do that. So our position is that those who have benefited for years got the greatest responsibility in terms of reducing emissions. And smaller countries, developing countries, now coming into the market, and given that we would still have a decade at least more, where we will be using fossil fuels, let those countries be able to use that resource, because they're going to do fossil fuels different and transition. So what we're doing is using that resource to transition to clean energy, but also to transition our agriculture sector and so on. And so I like to call it a just transition. These are the nuances I think we have to look at. If we take Africa, for example, electricity was discovered, 100+ years ago. Half of Africa still don't have electricity. Are we going to tell them to wait for this, if they find oil? So we have to find a way of dealing with that. On the balancing with the forest and agriculture, it's a real question. And I think we have been able to do it just because of how our geography is, where the coast is where a lot of the fertile lands are, and we do a lot of the agriculture there. The forests we have, mainly our indigenous peoples, and we have avoided giving large tracts of land there for agriculture purposes, because we believe that we need to balance it. That might not be the same scenario for a lot of other countries. It comes back, though, to the question of how do we educate our population in terms of what climate change is doing and what this means. It's a really difficult balancing act, and that's why I say it's so complex, because people got to eat, but people just don't want to eat. People want to thrive as well. And sometimes that would require certain actions that we might see inimic to the climate agenda. I didn't answer your question completely, but I thought I'd share that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thanks to Daniel and Sarah. I'm really honored that the three of you were willing to join this panel and rich discussion. I know there are many more questions, but hopefully over a cup of coffee, we can talk more. Please join me in thanking the panelists for this excellent discussion.